Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining this session. My name is Ahmed Nazal, and I am an analyst in AB Accelerator at Arab Bank. AB Accelerator is a corporate accelerator that focuses on investing and partnering with Fintech startups globally. To learn more about AB Accelerator, I'll be adding our website to the chat. Feel free to visit us and reach out with any questions or feedback. In today's webinar, we have a very special speaker, Didier Bonnet. Didier Bonnet is a professor of strategy and digital transformation at IMD Business School in Switzerland. He is also a strategy consultant and EVP with Capgemini Invent, where he leads the digital transformation practice. He has more than 30 years of experience in strategy development and business transformation for global clients and has experience in over 15 countries. The main question today is, how do we orchestrate the transformation journey? In today's session, Professor Didier will be discussing digital transformation strategies, frameworks, and practices, touching upon the new frontiers of digital transformation, the post-COVID digital economy, and the orchestration of a successful transformation journey. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section, and please upvote any questions that you might find as relevant or interesting. We will address these questions in the final segment of this session. I will be passing it on to you, Didier, to lead the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today. And for the attendees, thank you as well, and please enjoy.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. No problem at all. Delighted to be here. Let me just share my screen. All right, I hope that's the technology is helping us, I hope. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry, I would have loved to be in person, but as in the current circumstances, we have to do everything remotely, and thank God the digital technology is helping most of the time when it works. So glad to be here. And yes, as Ahmad said, we spent the last really 10 years or just over 10 years with a group at the MIT in Boston, try to really look into what this digital transformation journey is all about. And to be honest, 10 years ago, no one was really mentioning digital transformation very often, whereas today it's like become a thing that everybody mentions. So we really start looking into how does it actually work, and in particular with a focus on the larger firms, because this is where a lot of legacy exists. And where clearly the transformation is much more complicated than if you're a digital native, starting from scratch with your organization. So back then, you probably will remember everyone was talking about the new economy. It was like digital was just opening up a completely new economy. And I must admit, as an economist by training, by background myself, I was very, very dubious and saying, what is really new about this economy? And over time, I really changed my mind. And the reason is the following, is that I think that digital transformation has really fundamentally reshaped many aspects of how we look at competition, how we differentiate our products and services, and so on and so forth. And we're all familiar today with the concept of ecosystem of partnerships and things like that. We've seen the boundaries of competition really changing. I mean, when I was started in consulting, for instance, we used to have very, very defined industries. We could codify any segment of industry. Today, you could be competing against people from 5 or 6 different industries. If you take Amazon, for instance, it's really complicated to say, are they a bookseller, an IT company, or whatever else. In fact, they're all of that. So the notion of industry is really gone down. We've seen a lot of development around the customer experience as being the most important rather than product feature. And I think we've seen a lot of change in the strategy itself. So for those on the webinar who have been to business school like me during either the 80s or the 90s, we were versed in strategy through Michael Porter, who basically say there's 2 ways you can differentiate. You can either, or two ways you can craft your strategy. You can either be the lowest cost producer, so the cheapest, or you can be the most differentiated, the most featured. I think that's changed today, really. If you take companies that are well known, like Uber, for instance. For me, it's like it's cheaper than the London cab, which is where I live, but it's also a fantastic experience. It's very intuitive, very simple experience. So I think this notion of how you drive advantage has really changed and probably moved more towards what I call scale effect and the use of data to predict consumer behavior. And then also Porter said, if you remember that, the way that you defend against competition is you erect barrier to entries by amassing assets. So, this is back from if you're in oil and gas or anything, you'll know what that means, or in telecoms, you have to basically put a lot of physical assets in order to prevent your competitors from copying you. But today we're not seeing that. We're seeing actually companies that are, global and huge, like Airbnb, for instance, who have very little assets to talk about, and so on and so forth. So you see that a lot of these changes have happened, and even the last point we knew about how do you actually value a company, and we used to have a very simple methods of valuing, whether it was DCF, whether it was asset base, and then we used to add a premium on top of it. Today, you can't value on asset; you have to value on interaction and scale, and which is why you're seeing a lot of these early development in digital companies being really valued on the basis of what they could potentially do, which is, in other words, how can they scale? Okay, so you can see that on the number of areas, competition, strategy, innovation, valuation, everything has really changed. And this is why I kind of changed my mind as to this is a profound change in the economy. So that's for what's happening. At the same time, we've seen a lot of changes in consumer behavior. And I give it to you that this is probably not the most academic slide you've ever seen, but I hope it makes the point that, the way that we're using technology nowadays as consumers, and same thing in a B2B environment, is really, really fundamentally changing the way that we consume our time, how we consume product, and so on and so forth. So those are the really big trends in terms of competition and consumer behavior, and that's why it's led to digital transformation being virtually an imperative for all firms, and particularly the large firms, because the new firms over the last 10 years have really started with a headway into digital technology, whereas large firm, as I mentioned, were really burdened to some extent with some legacy. So what we did with my colleagues from the MITs, we looked at about 500 global firms, large firms. So I think the smallest is just below $1 billion. So these are very large firms, and really tried to answer two questions. One is, what are these large companies globally doing with digital technology, and are the people that seems to be ahead using different rules, or do they have a model that we can codify that would tell us how digital transformation actually works for large firms? So a very simple sort of questions. Are they doing better, and if yes, what are they doing differently from the others? So the good news is that we did find companies that were seem to be streaming ahead in the early days, and you can see from that slide, and I could have had many others, that you've got B2B well-known brands, B2C well-known brands like Nike or Burberry were really early adopters of digital transformation, but you also have companies like Schneider Electric, or either companies you probably never heard of, like Asian Paints, who's one of the biggest coating company in Asia, or Codelco, who's a mining company in Chile, will I come back to. So that told us that it really wasn't that specific on the industry. So there was another reason why people were shooting ahead. So what we try to do is basically understand, okay, what are they doing differently? And here comes the model that really will help to understand how digital transformation work. And it's really two-dimension. One we call digital capability, which is the what of digital transformation. This is all about where do you make smart investment with your digital technology on the customer experience, operational processes, or even trying to change your business model. Okay, so it's where do you make those smart investment. But when we start researching, we said, okay, if it was just about making smart investment, then the richer firms will always win, right? Because they have more money to invest. And it wasn't what we found. We found a lot of very rich firms investing a lot and not making any progress. So we sort of found out there was another dimension, which is what we call the how, which is really more around what we call leadership capabilities, more the softer side of the exercise. So really, how do you actually start effective change with these technologies inside your corporation? How do you engage people? How do you craft your vision, and so on and so forth? So you got it that there is obviously an investment side, which is the what, and then there is an organizational side and people side, which is more the how. So that's the framework we came up with. And of course, when you're with academics, you have two dimensions. You end up with a 2x2, which is what we did. And in this 2x2, what we try to do is really assess the digital maturity of all the companies in our samples, which are the dots that you see there. And we found really 4 categories. That beginners, I won't spend much time, because as your name indicates, there are people that are not doing very much with digital transformation, and unfortunately, there are still some today. If you go to conservatives, these are people that are actually used to effecting change in their organization quite well, but they can't scale it. Okay, so they can't really develop the investment. Companies, so that's one reason. So Asian Paints, for instance, started really focused on the supply chain, trying to get supply chain visibility, but they couldn't excite their management. And in fact, it took a change of CEO for them to really move up to what we call digital masters. In conservative, you often find also highly regulated industries or industries that are heavily financially run. Show me the ROI, show me the ROI, and so on. So those are conservative, which is, but they have really good change capability. If you flip to the other side, diagonally, the fashionistas are people that do a million things. So when you talk to CEOs in these companies, they'll tell you, hi Didier, yes, I'm doing a lot in digital transformation. I've got all these experiments all over the place. My strategy is let 1,000 flower bloom, and then when 2 years later, we'll take a look and see what works, and we'll scale what works. And in fact, these are strategies that are very dangerous, because what you find is that it's very actually hard to find scalable successes in these companies, and there is a lot of duplication. So for instance, we talked to a bank, which was a global bank, who had developed about 7 different apps, customer apps, roughly doing the same thing, but on 7 different platforms, 7 different user interfaces, and so on and so forth. So you can see how, from a cost perspective, this is not a smart thing to do, and creates a lot of duplication and very little rigor about how you develop. And of course, the best place to be is a digital master, where you balance the investment that you're making in digital technology with the change internally. So that's all very well, and of course everyone wants to be a digital master, but the question that we were asked by all the executive at the time was, okay, but if I become a digital master, do I make more money? So, which was a complex question. So let me take you through. So the answer is yes, but in very different ways. So there's 2 effects. One effect, if you look at the chart on the left, you'll see that there is an effect on revenue generation efficiency. In other words, that the more you invest in digital technology, the more you will have revenue generation efficiency, which means you can sell more with the same level of assets. Okay, so if you think intuitively about an e-commerce platform, you're creating a new channel, you're not really dramatically increasing your resources, but you're selling a little bit more. And even the fashionista, which I sort of made fun of, in that is where I've got positive result. But it's single digit. Where it got really interesting was when we looked at profitability on the right, where you see the numbers here change radically, and you have a 26% gap in profitability between the very mature company, the digital masters that are very mature in digital transformation, and the rest. Okay, and there you see that our fashionista are actually have a negative return on that. So 26%, just so you know, take it with a pinch of salt, because it's an average of all the industry. So in other words, we measured the banks, we measured the retailers, we measured the manufacturers, then we averaged the lot. But what it told us is, yes, there is a financial incentive, and a very strong financial incentive, to do this kind of programs. Okay. So let's dissect a little bit what these programs are all about. So I mentioned the what and the how. Let's start by looking at the what. No surprises. I'm sure most of your companies are already looking at the world of digital transformation that way. You can really influence customer experience by sort of digitizing how you serve your customers, how you connect to them, how you analyze the data that they're sending back to you in order to serve them better, and so on and so forth. And to be honest, if we went back 5 years, a lot, I would say 70 to 80% of the activity was on the customer experience, and that's probably a good thing. Okay. The middle one, which is more around what we call today connected operations, or operations generally, which was more about how do I automate my processes, how do I equip my workforce with new tools to make them more efficient, how do I have more visibility of my business in real time, so I can manage and optimize better. And this is an area really where, as I say, was not the majority of the activity. What we've seen in the last few years is an explosion in that area. An explosion meaning that some of the industrial firms that started very late in digital transformation are really catching up. And the reason is obvious. It's because of things like IoT and other technology that are really enabling you to make a step change in your operations. And then finally, you can change the business model, or at least try to experiment with your business model. I'll give you my perspective on that. I think there's probably a lot more talk today around disruption and business model change rather than action. When we did the study, I think we found that probably only 5 to 10% of the company were truly looking at their business model. I think that's accelerating now because a lot more industries are being disrupted, but it's not the main play in the what category, if you will. So free customer experience, how do I affect my operation? How do I start looking differently at my business model? So what could that mean for a bank, for instance? So, and those ingredients of a good experience, if we take the first one, can be applied really to many industries. It's really around ease of use. So we know today that a good customer experience beats a good product anytime. Okay, so you can add all the functionalities you want in the product. If the experience is not good, it just won't work. We know that it's highly personalized. There is a data flow going from your company to customers, from customer back, whether it's transaction data, behavioral data, social media data. We're inundated with data today. So really the trick today is to move from data to intelligence, so you can actually personalize services, make it useful. Engaging, which is all around how do I engage people that use my products, not just at the point of purchase, but continuously. And I think social media over the last few years has been a great tool for that. Mobility, we all know this is not a new trend, but having, in banking, it's been phenomenal in terms of providing on-the-go banking facilities, which is become a de facto must-have today. And then the last point, which is a little bit more subtle, is there is a tendency for people to see we either go digital or we go non-digital. In fact, what we've seen from the high successes of companies like Burberry and others is that they tend to mesh the two very, very effectively. So in other words, is that it doesn't mean that your physical services and products get thrown away and replaced by digital. It sometimes complements what you're trying to do. Okay. So let me give an example of a company called BBVA, which I'm sure you know, which is a Spanish-based bank. I mean, they have done a tremendous job on the customer experience. Today, 40% of their sales come through digital channels. But more importantly, what they've noticed as they got better with that is that with digital, they were getting a magnitude more customer interactions. So in other words, I mean, you can see the quote from Gonzalo, which says they interact every 2 days, whereas it used to be month, which has the benefit of not just having engaged customer, but also getting a lot more data back from your customers. And this is really important because it's all dependent, as I mentioned, on how you design your customer experience. And let me give you an example of it. I will share a secret with you that I found this data this morning. And I was thinking of this webinar, and I say, oh, that's really interesting. So just to show the experience, what does it actually mean? And this is basically a really simple thing. It's about opening an account, and people have measured the number of clicks. And you can see how radically different the services are from Revolut, which is a banking facility which I use here in the UK, which has got 24 clicks, down to a First Direct, we've got 120. So really, really important to spend time on the design of your customer experience from the user's perspective. So from the user perspective backwards. So that's the customer experience side. Let me move maybe to some of the things that are shifting operations, and this is really truly company transformational for most organizations, because it's not just the operation that are changing, it's the flow of data within a company, and therefore how you start running them differently. And it's all based on a bunch of fairly advanced technology that I think will drive us to run our company more in a distributed intelligence model, as I call it. So there was one which was highly talked about, and is still very talked about, which is blockchain and distributed ledgers, which I think, and I'll give you again my perspective. I think for cryptocurrency, we've seen amazing development. For the others, which were really promising, like contract and a few other things, the jury really is still out in this technology, in the sense that we haven't really cracked the use cases at scale, with very, very minor exception. But I think it's a technology that has a lot of promise, and I think over the next 5 to 10 years or whatever, we will see better application. The only caveat I would put is that a lot of the use case I'm seeing today are things that you can do with very secure databases at a fraction of the cost. So I think we need to get this technology going on really critical applications. Okay. The second one that you can't avoid mentioning is AI, and this is data that I trust, because it's data that comes from a joint venture between Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, where they measure the same sample every year. So you can see that the progression of the machine capability, at least for voice recognition and speech recognition, has been tremendous. And now machines are just as good as human. Human make about a 5% error rate, word error rate, when they recognize human voice, and the machines are just about the same, or even probably better, because you can see the data has not been updated since 2017. So this has been a tremendous type of progress in technology. But my point is that it's not really the technology that matters; is what do you do with it. And a very common application, which I'm sure you all know, was Amazon Echo, which was in the early days. And I think the important bit is not the fact that Amazon or Google or Microsoft have sold a lot of kits, as you can see on the left. What's amazing to me is the number of skills that this machine can do. So skills is basically functionalities that you can speak to this machine about, like ordering a cab, for instance. When I'm a geek, so I bought the first Amazon as soon as it was available in the UK. But I remember all I was doing is say, "Hey, Amazon," or "Hey, Alexa, play a Rolling Stone tune." It was really using music. Today, you can order it. You can talk to it to order your taxi, to order your favorite pizza, to order a prepared meal from your favorite restaurant, and it's an amazing array. And you can see the skill set has virtually doubled in a year, and we will see that continuing, because the voice is really a natural interface for people. Now, what does it mean, for instance, in the world of banking? Well, it's highly applicable, because the little example that you can see on the right of a company called Westpac, which is, I'm sure you know, an Australian banking facility, has really put all of the basic services that a bank does on a voice recognition machine like Alexa, and it's working really well. So you can see that it's not just about AI in terms of the technology and the progress, but how quickly we can take those technology and apply them to the real world, and to banking in this case. Same thing has happened for visual recognition, so object or faces and so on. And there, the machines are actually better than humans. Now it has, it has downside consequences particularly for face recognition, which have been well described. But it's quite amazing, particularly in the world of manufacturing, for instance. If you think about a quality assurance type model where you can have robots now that are very, very cheap, actually looking at objects and doing all the quality assurance at incredibly accurate rate for a fraction of the cost of what it used to cost us. So I could give you another 50 examples of all these things, but I think the key point I want to leave you with on the what is that this is really fundamentally changing the way that we are going to run organization, and not necessarily today at this very minute, but I think over time, as we deploy this technology across our organization, and if you think about a bank, we're already doing RPA into the core processes in the back office. We're already doing some process automation in other areas. We're augmenting employee with smart routing, answers guidance, first sales reaction and so on. We are putting chatbots into call centers and so on. So you're seeing all this technology penetrating. You're seeing we're moving from a very rule-based type of analytics to a very self-learning, machine learning type based analytics, which I think over time is really going to change the way we even run organization. And why am I saying that is because we have spent many years trying to optimize our organization. If you think about re-engineering processes, that's not new. We were doing that 30 years ago. And all it was about was really optimizing processes. And it was a good thing to do for profitability and efficiency. But machines can do that better than humans. So I think this notion of optimization for organization will really shift towards more innovation and product development in the future, because the basic optimization will be done by machines. So we'll get smarter, basically, which is good news. Now, let me say a couple of words. I mentioned earlier on that the third pillar, so we've looked at customer experience, we've looked at operation, and the third pillar was business model. And this is a little bit of a joke, but I think disruption has become like punk rock. Everybody's disrupted. We're going to die tomorrow, and big companies are going to be taken over by small ones, and so on and so forth. I have my doubts from a number of angles. One is that when you actually crunch the numbers, some of the industries that you think are highly disrupted because they talk about it every day are actually not being disrupted at all. And some of the others that you think are pretty steady are actually being highly disrupted. So for instance, oil and gas has been highly disrupted even before what happened with COVID-19 and the price of oil. So we have to take a little bit of a pinch of salt as to what's really being disrupted. But the fact is that we are being dissected by new entrants all the time. So I think if you take, again, some basic services in financial services like no-frills banking, payments, auto insurance, and so on, you can find, and I could have probably added 100 labels there, you find somebody that's looking at this chunk of the business in a very different way than you are. Okay? And I think that the second reason why I said, disruption, you have to look at it slightly differently today, or at least that's my experience, is because we set up the narrative in the old days to be, it was David and Goliath. He was the little startup, we're going to take over the big firms, and the big firm, we're going to collapse. That's not what we're seeing today. And I think the AB incubator is an exact example of that, is that it's all about collaborating rather than straight competition. Now, there are a few exceptions, like if you could take a look at payment here, you have companies like Apple, which is not really a startup, but generally I think we've learned to understand that the collaboration with particularly with startup is much more productive than this notion of everyone disrupting everybody else. Of course, there will be exceptions to what I'm saying. So I think my message is like we need to be paranoid because it's a good thing, but we need to be realistic about what's really happening to our industries. And I think again, I would encourage everyone in different industry to really look at the level of disruption that's really going on. And my third message is that we are focusing too much on the disruptor. And by that I mean, oh, look at this company. You must hear it every day. Somebody bump into you in the office when we used to go to the office or on a Zoom call and say, oh, I've seen this company. They're really going places. They're going to take over the whole industry. I would encourage to focus on the nature of the disruption rather than the disruptor, because as you can see from these examples, Uber never killed taxis. It was just that the taxi experience, at least in London and even worse in Paris, was terrible. It was, you couldn't get them. They were expensive. The drivers were rude, and so on and so forth. So focus on where the nature of the disruption comes from. Is it that people tend to move more to a subscription model or this kind of thing, rather than the little disruptor that's really making headway? Of course, you're always looking at competition, but I think you understanding in detail the disruption is much more effective in digital transformation over time. Okay, and then the second part is that where there is disruption, we've seen incumbents generally being quite slow. On average, about 3/4 are taking 2 years to respond to disruption, which is far too long, as I'm sure you'll realize. And there are plenty of good reasons for that. Number one being cannibalization, lower margin, the resources that are not aligned, complacency, and so on and so forth. So really, the time to respond to a disruption is really important. And that's really about how you have organized your what I call the innovation architecture. How are you able to take something that's happening in industry, test it, run it, use some of your own customer data to really test it in real terms, and then scale it. Okay, so that flow is really important to get right if you want to disrupt. So that's basically in a very, very quick way the what of the story. So we've seen customer experience, we've seen operation, we've talked about new business model and disruption. Let me share with you a piece of data that I found originally really worrying, and then I went behind it to try to understand. So this is, remember, the what and the how. So digital capability is the what, leadership capability is the how. And we've measured between 2012, 2018, what has really changed. So in other words, are company getting better or worse at doing these two things? And you'll see from this data that when it comes to investing in digital capabilities, actually pretty much the same. The capabilities have changed because we now have, as we've just seen, we've got blockchain, we've got AI, we've got IoT. So the capabilities change, but people generally can adapt and integrate this kind of technology. What's really worrying is the leadership capability, the how, has gone down by 10 points. And when I went through behind the data, my conclusion was that actually it doesn't mean that companies are getting worse at the change side of the exercise. Is that I think everyone was a little bit over optimistic in the early days. So in other words, everyone focused digital transformation as being digital first and transformation second. And then as we got more and more into our transformation, we've discovered that, oh my God, transformation is actually about organization, people, structures, and so on. And this is really hard, as we always know. So I think that's what's going on now. And so let me talk a little bit about the how of digital transformation. So in other words, how do you effect this change and really turn this technology investment into a digital advantage? And I must admit that when we started the research, we heard a lot of people telling us that real change was bottom up, that with bring your own device, we will see particularly young millennials bringing new tools into the workplace, changing the way that we work, changing the processes, and then forcing senior management to really change their organization. We found zero example of that, at least in our sample, not a single one. Every single curtailed digital transformation was always with very, very strong top-down leadership. And please don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that it's not good to have young millennials experimenting at the edges. That's perfect, and you want that. But it means that if you really want to transform your organization, it can only be done with a very, very strong alignment at the top, driving these programs right down the organization, because they are complex. And there are really 5 areas that stick out in terms of what makes a difference between the winners and the people that were struggling. And the first one is vision, which is a term, and I apologize, a term I hate because it's very vague, but I will give you a practical example of what that means. And it's really important to say, why are we doing this? So what is the overall objective of doing this? The second one is engagement and culture, and this is nothing new. Even before digital, we had business transformations that were very complex because you need to engage people, and the culture always got in the way. I think what's changed with digital is you can do engagement at scale today because of tools like the one we're using right now. The third one is governance, which is really not the most exciting topic on the planet, but it's really one of the key driver of the profitability numbers that I showed you earlier on, to really avoid those duplication and duality of efforts that we've seen earlier on. And I'll come back to that, because I think structuring a proper governance is really where I see a lot of companies failing their digital programs. It's like too scattered. Technology and business integration, I think we know that today. It used to be that IT departments had the monopoly of technology integration in the firm. This is over. The HR people are buying IT, the marketing people are buying IT, the supply chain people are buying IT. So everyone's buying technology. It's more about how do you orchestrate the development of your digital initiative in joint cross-functional teams across the business. So basically ending this flow of specification, pilots and things that used to take months, and really move more into an agile model, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And then the last one in the middle, which is really should be bigger because it's one of the most important. It's all about the capabilities and workforce enablement. And that's one thing we found, and I'm finding every day, is that the capability of the organization is really what makes a huge difference in this kind of game. So let me just give you a highlight on each of those. So this is the company Codelco I mentioned earlier on. It's a Chilean copper mining company, which is government owned. So you wouldn't have started looking at digital leaders in that particular area. And yes, we did. And so the chart on the left is what they told us when we first saw them. I think it's 2009. And they basically say, look, today mining is a very manual exercise, and we knew it because we were in a mine talking to them. And then tomorrow, and you can see there's no date. It says tomorrow we're going to see that it's probably mostly based on knowledge and technology. So in other words, that the mining, which is a very physical exercise, will move more towards a virtual, so knowledge and technology exercise. And then when I must admit that this time I said, yeah, great idea, but I don't know what you really mean. And then we came back, I think it was 2-3 years, and the CDO at the time sort of say, let's come and have a discussion about what we've done. And what they've done is really broken down this vision into various programs, which they call Codelco 1, 2, and 3. The first time was about getting real-time operations. So this is putting sensors in the ground so they can actually control a single mine operation, so efficiency and productivity and so on. Then they moved into full automation, which was really automating all the machineries in the mine. And if you've been on a mine, or if you've seen a truck on a mine is like massive. And those were automated long before Google managed to do an autonomous vehicle. And then go into something that's quite amazing, which is let's move into a completely human-free mining. And today, this company has about 4 or 5 mines in Chile and I think in Australia where there's nobody underground. So you can see what this vision means. It can be very fluffy at the beginning, very sort of directional, and then you start breaking it down, experimenting and moving along the line. That's how most of the company I've done it, and you can see at the bottom I've put NTT Data, Honeywell, and Rockwell Automation, which were the major partner of Codelco. So you cannot do it just on your own because you don't have all the capabilities that you need. So that's a vision side. The engagement, I'll be very brief. I mean, it's something that you guys probably all know, but I think the biggest mistake I see in engagement is people focusing too much on the technology deployment versus the user adoption. So in other words, that it happens a lot when the accountability of a digital transformation is on the technical team, that it's all about deployment. So I've deployed this tool in 85 countries in 6 months, job done. And then you go and see these countries and you say, okay, what is that used for? The users are totally confused because they've not been trained, they've not been explained how it does their jobs better, and so on and so forth. So I think my message on engagement is, whenever you spend $1 on the technology, you probably need to spend a couple of dollars or more on the adoption, because and the reason I'm saying that is obvious, is that the return on the investment calculation is never on the deployment. It's always on the usage and the adoption. So really, to ensure the benefit of your investment, spending time on adoption is really the key to it. We mentioned culture, and this is a survey that makes me laugh because we've done it like 6 or 7 times, and we always get the same results. And the results are the following. The question, by the way, is what is the biggest hurdle to your digital transformation? And it's always culture. Okay, and you can see 62%. It varies a little bit year by year, but it's always at the top. And then the second thing that always come clear from these surveys over the 5 or 6 times that we've done them is when we say, would you consider that your company is, more digital, the culture of your company is more digital today than it was before, you always see the leaders being much more optimistic than the employees. Why? Because the employees are at the coalface, and if you believe what I've just said about adoption, this is where the pain really lies. So I think really important again this adoption point, because you don't change culture by doing a culture program. You change culture by changing the way that people interact with each other, people do their work, and this is the key to it. But culture is always a big issue, and also with culture comes the education part, which we'll come to in a minute. And then there's governance, and I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but basically this is highly simplified. But if we take all the models of governance we've seen, there are basically 4. One which I call business as usual power of digital, which is basically you keep exactly the same organizational structure that you have today. So all the programs are funded within existing P&Ls, which keeps a simple mandate, simple accountability, and so on and so forth. The only danger is that as soon as you have a bad quarter, these things tend to slow down. Okay. Then we have new digital roles, and I won't spend much time on that because we've all heard about chief digital officers. This can be incredibly useful as an accelerator. We've seen that in companies like Starbucks, for instance, but it really depends on the level of authority that you give to these people. If they're buried as -4, -5 in your organization, it's unlikely they'll succeed. Then there's shared digital unit, which is basically people deciding to pool some of the resources into a unit or a digital group. We've seen some really good example of that over the past. The big difficulty there is that you want to make sure that there's a direct connection to the operation, because otherwise it becomes the kind of ivory tower type of stuff. There's a lot of exciting things that happen here, but it never gets actually transferred and scaled into the real business. And then if you find it's really difficult, you can always go greenfield. And I think a lot of people, both in banking, but in areas like telecom, where the level of legacy is so big that every time you want to do something different, you have to have an IT program just to change a few things. People say, okay, this is too hard. Let's start as a greenfield operation. We can put a new technology stack. We can have a new different economic model. We can hire different type of people, and so. And sometimes it works. I've used the example of Marcus, for instance, who did a bank or retail bank on the side. The danger, of course, there is cannibalization and this notion that you're going to migrate your old system to the new one is good on paper, but it's very rare to see it happening. But the key point, I think, is that governance model, whichever one you choose, and again, they should match very tightly with the kind of culture you have, whether you're centralized or decentralized. You may pick a very different model, but without a strong governance model, it becomes very difficult to actually succeed. I won't spend much time about the connection with IT. We talked about that. I think, we used to talk about aligning IT to the business strategy and so on and so forth. I think this is over. It's like we need fusion now. We need fusion of technology skills with business skills. So in other words, fusion meaning not just cross-functional agile teams working together, but people speaking a slightly different language, in the sense that, marketing people much more aware today of the technology possibility and analytics and so on and so forth. Equally, technology people much more aware of the business issue that we're trying to crack, like personalization and so on and so forth. I think we've made really good progress there. There's still a long way to go, but it's absolutely critical to move away from the old model of, there is technology and then there is the business. And then when we've seen all the leaders really moving to these sort of mixed models. And this could over time change the way that we organize IT in organization, because it's very dispersed across the organization. So we may have to change the way we run technology within organization. Now let me finish with this. I talked about the workforce and the capability side being the most important. I think what we found, if I had to draw one conclusion, is we found that the ability of the technology possibilities is far ahead of our ability to adapt our organization, and particularly our workforce. And this is something we've got to spend time. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. So you have to try a new thing. Like, yes, you can hire new people. You have to retrain some of your workforce, not all of them, but a big, particularly the front-end people, have to be retrained in terms of understanding what digital means to them in their work. You have to partner with other people. So you have to do a number of things to really raise the IQ and the capability of your workforce, including a lot of education. Okay. And one of the things that really I was disappointed about is when we did the research is that, when we asked the question, what's the biggest hurdle? A lot of people mentioned skills and competency. Like a big majority, for over 3/4. But when we looked at how many HR organizations were actually involved in the transformation, it went down to 30%. Okay, very few. And I think you got to drag, HR people, not people counting the number of days holiday, but people that can help with this organizational change that's happening, all this education that's required in order to really move your population as you develop your transformation. So let me finish just basically saying that, why do we have to get good at this? Because I'm seeing a shift now between the people that were doing really well in the last 10 years, really accelerating into, or graduating, if you will, into this new world of AI and IoT and machine learning and so on, really moving because they've done the hard work of trying to understand how digital transformation work. And then I'm seeing a bunch of companies that are still struggling with basic things like, governance, or getting their IT to behave differently with the business, and so on and so forth. And I think what's going to happen is we may have a big gap between these two groups of companies, which would mean that, some companies might find it hard to thrive over time, whereas others will shoot ahead as the technology continues to develop. Because one thing we're for certain is that even with the big disruption we've had right now, we're seeing technology continuing to accelerate and providing new business opportunity for people. So should we move to questions? Let me disconnect that.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you very much, Didier.
Don't worry.
Insightful and interesting presentation. We will now be moving on to the Q&A session. I will start with the first question. Right. So in this region, while banks have started to embark on digital transformation and innovation, the regulatory environments remain quite conservative and fragmented. and show more difficulties to adapt new technologies at the same pace as the private sector. What advice do you give to banks?
So, I mentioned that's one of the reason why a lot of financial services company, certainly in the early days, but still true today, were slightly hard to get off the starting block, was this notion about regulation. I mean, we had companies talking to us saying, Didier, I cannot be on social media because everything I say can be construed as investment advice. Okay, for instance, and yet there were companies that were actually going round this kind of, not by breaking the regulation, but going round and try to experiment on other matters. So I think it should. The big danger is to use regulation and compliance, if you will, which is a big part also of what banks do, as an excuse for not continuing your transformation. Okay, you can still do a lot in the customer interaction that you have. Of course, you have to be very careful with what you do with the data, but by the way, so have retailers, so have everyone else. And you can do a hell of a lot to your operations by automating your processes as much as you can. So I think, yes, it is an issue. I am truly hoping and I'm praying that, with what's happened recently with this crisis, the governments and the regulators will realize that technology is not the enemy, it's actually the enabler. And that hopefully they will be sometimes more helpful than they are today to help companies move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. The second question we have is, digital transformation requires a high appetite for risk. How should large organizations foster a culture of risk-taking?
Good. That's an excellent question. Excellent question. So, and the answer is that, I'm not giving you a consultant answer, yes and no on one or the other. The answer is that it does not need to have, so you need some appetite for risk because, for instance, the AB accelerator is a decision. Your company has made the decision to build this vehicle. Was it certainty 100% when they started? Probably not. So you need an element of risk taking, I guess, to move into new areas because, to be honest, some of these areas you won't even be able to put a business case together because it's impossible. You're exploring new territory, but you can do it in an intelligent way, and in particular, I think what I've seen most organizations who are doing that well doing is building a portfolio of initiatives. So in other words, it's not like, here's our big digital transformation, we have 17 streams and one roadmap and off you go. It's more understanding the portfolio where you have elements of your portfolio that are actually not that risky. They are digital re-engineering, if you want. Like if you take a process, you can actually improve the productivity. And the beauty with that is it will generate but it will generate short-term return, ROI, that can help you then to fuel other things. You have ventures that are more cross-functional to your organization, like integrating your channels, for instance, that actually starting to require a big transformation program. You're working cross silos, you're working in a lot of, so that's a bit more difficult. And then if you go to the extreme, you have ventures that are changing your business model. And think about GE when they decided many moons ago to say, we're going to become the industrial internet, we're going to build a platform to help industrial companies. So that was a big risky move, and actually it did prove quite risky in the end. But so I guess what I'm saying is you have to manage the risk profile through a portfolio approach, because not all digital initiatives have got the same weight or the same risk, and then find the funding flow where you can actually fuel the experimentations that you're doing with things that you're doing in the short term. And I would also say that this digital transformation field today allows you to do a lot of experimentation very, very well, because we can get the data. We can prove the point, and so on and so on. So if you set your experiments well, then it's easy, to see whether it works or not, and then to be able to scale. The last piece of advice I would give to large companies, because I see that all the days, that if it doesn't work, kill the project. Okay, I'm seeing too many companies starting things, experimenting everywhere, and never killing anything. And even if the ROI is not quite there, so you've got to be as brutal as taking some risks to start an experiment. But if it works, you scale it. If it doesn't work, you kill it.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer, Didier. The third question we have is, so what are the metrics that organizations should measure, should utilize to measure their innovation efforts?
Wow. That could be, so I've just finished a program, again, with the MIT on corporate innovation. And that was one of the most complex thing ever because, and it's not an escape route, it's because, there are some things in innovation that if you think about innovation horizon between, incremental to complex to changing my business model, of course, you have very different risk profile attached to each of these and very different metrics. I mean, people that are moving, for instance, to a subscription model, wow, it's very hard to test the reaction of your customer and therefore to forecast once you've moved everyone to this model, at which point would they switch? There are a lot of complication. So I think you have to be clear that there are things that are really easy to measure, particularly more on the incremental and semi-complex side. And there are things where you got to give a little bit of leeway into your innovation because it's actually very hard. I think it's back to my point about the portfolio. I would have the same point about innovation, is make sure that you have a nice mix of projects that are measurable and can deliver in certain time frame, and others where it doesn't mean you don't measure them, but it's much more difficult to produce an actual measure. And I think working with your financial community very tightly, for instance, to understand what the shape of this portfolio looks like, I think is really good practice, because as we know, financial people will always say, okay, what's the ROI? How much of this stuff are you going to sell next year, or next quarter, even worse, so I think it's more about how you build this balance, understanding that, as usual, you're in exploitation and exploration mode all the time. So understand what part of innovation is to exploit the current business as it is, and what's the exploration bit. Getting that right in the head of innovation and senior leaders is really key.
Thank you, Didier. The last question we have is, so how has the COVID crisis impacted digital transformation strategies?
Wow, okay. So answer is hugely. I mean, we know, it's but I think I would put a caveat to it. So I think what we've seen is, you remember the point I made a point which I insisted on about this notion of deployment and adoption. And the reason I'm saying that is because we spend a lot of money deploying tools, and then found that only people like me adopt tools because I like to try them, but then there's a huge tail in your organization, and not just because of age, but also because of the way these people, your human beings are, didn't adopt. What changed with COVID is you had no choice. That is the only game in town. So in terms of adoption, I think it's really, despite the dark side of the crisis and the health side and the pandemic, I think there might be a positive effect on digital transformation with this notion that people at least are able to use the tools that are being provided. The caveat, so I think good news, and good news. And we have seen, I could say the same thing about innovation. We've seen speed of innovation. The caveat is, if you think about the flow between the what and the how and what you have to put in place to drive the transformation, I don't think the adoption is the only answer, right? At some point, we're going to have to go back in our organization and start moving, the tanker again to get those initiatives going. And I think the increased adoption that we've seen recently will help, but it's not the total solution.
Thank you. I believe we have time for another two questions, or another couple of questions. The first one is, what are the common points where large corporates fail at fostering innovation?
I think so. The question was specifically on innovation, right? Or
Yes. So
rather than transformation. Okay. So for innovation, what I'm seeing, so people have understood that we've moved from a very internal model of innovation to now open innovation. Okay, and we've talked about open innovation now for 15 to 20 years. But yet, when the data that we have at least show that the shift has actually been very strong in the last 5 years. Hence why we're seeing a lot of innovation labs being created. We're seeing a lot of hackathons and link with universities and so on and so on. So this has happened. The difficulty I see internally in enterprise is how do you organize what I call the innovation architecture? How do you make sense of all this? Because what's happening today is the innovation lab reports to the marketing guy. The R&D reports to the operation guys. The hackathon are run by another group of people. So you have, and then there's an innovation person somewhere that owns another piece of the puzzle, and the chairman has decided that we're going to partner with that firm. Okay, so you've got this disparity of actions, and yet innovation is about growth and the next cycle, right? It's about going onto the next S curve, finding new source of growth or new source of value. We should have a more orchestrated way of saying, okay, why are we doing all these bits and how do we connect together, including the measurement, including how much each is supposed to bring. And I think unless we have this architecture, and that's what I'm seeing in a lot of organizations today, is that it's kind of completely disconnected from the actual business goals and business strategy of the firm. And I think we need to really refocus that, particularly as we have more and more tentacles of organization with the outside world, partners, suppliers, universities, and so on.
Thank you. Our final question is, what are the key influences in a work environment that are critical for success?
So, for me, the key influences are the people in the front line. So, of course, I mentioned that we didn't see any example of a successful digital transformation that wasn't top down, and that's still my belief. So the leadership thing is still very, very, very important. Of course, you need to get alignment at your executive level in order to drive the change down. But then afterwards, it's down to the people in the execution. So if you're working on your customer experience improvement, for instance, I would really encourage to really educate as much as you can the frontline people, but then involve them to co-design what you're trying to do at the same time. So this notion of linking the top level strategy and the initiatives with the people that are actually delivering, because if it doesn't make their work better, they won't adopt it. Okay? They will go back. People, human beings, all of us are naturally will fall back on what we know works and what we know we can do. So this is a big human change, which needs education, needs training, needs nurturing, but it also needs some engagement up front to co-design these solutions with them. So I would say, beyond the seniority and the alignment, I would say the frontline people, and this could be maintenance engineers and not just salespeople.
Excellent. I believe these are all our questions today.
Good.
Thank you very much, Didier.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
I would like also to thank everybody who attended. Please stay tuned for any future sessions. And thanks again, Didier.
No problem. Enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.